Welcome to the Clements Bookworm. This is, believe it or not, our 33rd episode, and I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. Today's meeting is being recorded to share online. This afternoon, you will receive an email with the recording and resources mentioned in today's broadcast. Just in case you're joining us for the first time or need a little reminder, we really encourage you to chime in the chat. We enjoy having the conversation and camaraderie with all of you. But if you can, change your setting to all panelists and attendees. That allows everyone to participate in the conversation. So, in order to help us keep all of the questions together, if you would, please put those in the Q&A section. You can also see the questions that other audience members are asking and give it a little thumbs up, and that will upvote it if it's a question you have as well. We have our live machine captions turned on today as part of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program. You can go to the live transcript button and toggle those on or off, and you can change the size of the text as well. I can only control so much of what you see on the screen, so please play around with it a little bit. I do have side-by-side mode enabled, which should allow you to see both the slides and the speaker. You can move the separator to change the relative size of each side. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, and teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. As a descendant of the Saginaw Chippewa tribe, it is my sad privilege to acknowledge that the University of Michigan was funded by and founded on Anishinaabe lands ceded in coercive historical treaties and through the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, most notably through the 1817 Treaty of Fort Meigs. And at the William L. Clements Library, we acknowledge that we have and continue to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. Karen?
Yes, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement statement on behalf of Wayne State University. Wayne State University rests on Wawayukanong, also referred to as Detroit, the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Three Fires Confederacy. These sovereign lands were granted by the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Wyandot nations in 1807 through the Treaty of Detroit. Wayne State University affirms Indigenous sovereignty and honors all tribes with a connection to Detroit. With our Native neighbors, Wayne State can advance educational equity and promote a better future for the earth and all people.
Thank you, Karen. So, we just heard Karen mention Detroit's Anishinaabe name again, and our poll today is asking if you know what it means in English. So if you haven't clicked that, I'm sorry, I'm gonna end the polling. So here we go, and we can see what everybody said. So many of you chose where the river flows. Are they right, Karen?
It's a great guess. It actually is. There's a couple of very similar meanings, but at the curved shores, which really indicates that sort of, if you live in Essex County on the other side of Detroit River, you see the curve of Essex County. So sort of speaks to that.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for participating in that poll this morning. Today's episode is generously sponsored by bookworm enthusiast Douglas Johnson. Thank you so much, Doug, for participating and for helping to fund our programming. We appreciate it a lot. It is now my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Quint, former Clements history intern, who will be in conversation with Karen Marrero. Jonathan is a doctoral candidate in the history department at the University of Michigan. He received his BA and MA degrees from the University of Windsor and has presented his research at conferences in Canada and the United States. Jonathan's dissertation project explores how ordinary people of the Detroit River region experienced the imposition of the US-Canadian border in 1796 and the subsequent efforts of American and British authorities to harden and police the border. His work charts the ebbs and flows of cross-border movement and exchange among the region's diverse population of French, British, and American settlers and Indigenous polities. In the fall, Jonathan wrote a three-part series titled Empire and Encounter at Detroit for the Clements Chronicles about Irish-born merchant and fur trader James Sterling. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to the conversation and happy to turn it over to you now.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Angela, for the kind words. I'm excited to be here today as a former Clements Library intern and to still be involved with the library. And of course, given the subject of Karen's book and being familiar with her work, that really added to my interest and excitement. So it's my pleasure to welcome Karen Marrero. Karen Marrero is Associate Professor of Early North American History at Wayne State University in Detroit and an Associate of the L.R. Wilson Institute for Canadian History at McMaster University. A transnational historian of the United States and Canada and the Northern Border, her work explores interactions between 17th, 18th, and early 19th century Indigenous peoples and Euro-Americans in the Great Lakes. Her book, Detroit's Hidden Channels, The Power of French Indigenous Families in the 18th Century, was jointly published in 2020 by Michigan State University Press and the University of Manitoba Press. She has published articles and book chapters on French and Native American women in the 18th century and on French and Native communities of the Detroit-Windsor borderland in the 1830s. She has presented her work at conferences of the American Historical Association, Canadian Historical Association, Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, the Organization of American Historians, and the Western History Association, among other venues. So as I mentioned, I'm very excited to be here today and talking about Karen's work in this book, Detroit's Hidden Channels. And I thought a good place to start would really be, while I have my copy and I'm familiar with the book, I thought I'd ask Karen if you could really just introduce your work to the audience today, share a little bit more about your argument, the setting, and really just provide an introduction for those who haven't read the book.
Thank you, Jonathan. I see I'm wearing the same blouse as in my picture. Wow, what an interesting thing. Anyway, I really I'm really honored to be here. I'd like to thank everybody who is actually here in this room, in this virtual room, with me and with all of us. And I'd like to thank the Clements. I'd like to thank Angela Onk and Jonathan, and especially Ann Bennington Helper, who has been immensely supportive as I prepared for this talk. I was twice a fellow at the Clements, once in 2006 and once in 2012. And they all know how I feel about them. As I mentioned, I devoted an entire paragraph in my acknowledgements just to the Clements and to the people there. It was such a warm and welcoming place and a source of such rich archival materials. So I look forward to going back. And Jonathan and I are going to be in somewhat of a conversation later on. And we've both utilized the Sterling letter book, and he much more recently than I. So I'm looking forward to having a conversation about that, and we'll see an image from that book later. So if I could have the first slide, please. So I'll give a very brief overview of the book and a few highlights. And I'm going to use some of the 3/4 of the images. There aren't a lot of them, but most of them are from the Clements collection. And a shout out and thank you to Brian Dunnigan, who made it possible for the Clements to acquire so many wonderful cartographic materials. So this first, let me just start by saying that the book is centered on Detroit's development in the course of the 18th century, starting from before the French actually officially arrived and built their fort, because there were a large number of diverse nations resident in Detroit long before the French got here. We mentioned Anishinaabe, Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi people. There were also Wendat people. There were Abenaki people for a short amount of time, Miamia people, Meskwaki people, Sauk people. So it was a very diverse indigenous region before the French got here. And that's the reason why Cadillac, who had been resident at Michilimackinac before Detroit was settled at the end of the 17th century, he knew what a geographically important region Detroit was. It's the place where it's the narrowest sort of place at which the system of waterways that originate in the Atlantic Ocean and St. Lawrence Seaway narrow. And you can continue through that waterway to the rest of the Great Lakes, to what is now the Illinois country, Fort Wayne, Indiana, and further to the Gulf of Mexico and Louisiana. So Detroit was a pivotal place. And some of these, the French native families I talk about in my book, and I really examine very closely because I actually follow people, track people, find names, and trying to sort of figure out who they are and what they were doing. The Frenchmen who married into indigenous communities and married indigenous women were in this region before Cadillac established his French fort in 1701. So they were already being adopted into indigenous families, and because of that, were safe to move around the area, and were taking part in the indigenous politics and economic system that was here before the French arrived. So when Cadillac came here, he really made use of these networks that were already operating at Detroit. So throughout the 18th century, these families just got stronger. More French men located down here, and they became so powerful because they were intermarried in indigenous networks that they had a big impact on the economic system and political system that was developing, and diplomatic system that was developing at Detroit. Some of these men I talk about in my book were working side by side with Cadillac, who were sort of working on his behalf or working together with him. And they really actually, I say in my book that it's because of these families that Detroit became such a thriving economic and political early metropolis. So they continued to get stronger and stronger, even as the British arrived after the 7 Years' War in 1760. The British had to sort of figure out how to negotiate, how to sort of tap into those networks. It wasn't easy. James Sterling is one example of that Jonathan and I will be talking about. But I also concentrate in the book on women, Indigenous and French women. They were absolutely essential. They were not peripheral to the establishment of these families. They were absolutely essential. Indigenous women had powerful roles in their communities that very different from what, for example, British women might have had. They had a lot more power, and that made marriage into their communities so lucrative for European men. So as we get to the British period and move through to the period right after Pontiac's War, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, in 1763, these families, even though they, even though their Yeah, Suzanne mentioned there were no communities before Indigenous communities before 1701, but a lot of work has been done to show that Indigenous peoples were moving through the Detroit area even before Cadillac arrived, and even a European concept of domesticity, or what it means to actually be settled, was very different from Indigenous concepts. So Indigenous people moved around seasonally, and Detroit was one of those places they moved to. In Pontiac's War, these French Indigenous families continued to have a lot of power. Some of them sided with the British, some of them sided with Pontiac and Indigenous nations during that war. It was a 6-month siege, and it was a contentious time for the city. So after Pontiac's War, these networks continued to be very powerful. Englishmen were marrying into them, marrying French women who could speak multiple Indigenous languages, whose fathers had been trading and dealing with Indigenous people for decades at this point. And my book ends in 1774. We've got the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. We've got the British very worried about maintaining their empire. And they're trying to maintain links with some of these family networks at Detroit in order to sort of maintain the political and economic power. So I chose to end the book there. So I want to just go through a few slides really quickly. This first slide really depicts, this first map depicts Detroit in 1749, really the height of the French presence. This map sort of shows you, it's got an inset of the plan of the fort itself, and some of these streets become main sort of thoroughfares for trade that's conducted. A lot of these families have houses on these main thoroughfares because they're good places to be in order to trade with Indigenous nations and with other French residents who are coming into the fort. And you can get a sense too of Lake St. Clair at the top and the French habitations or habitations at the top. And some of these sort of cartographic or topographical locations on either sides of the shore that are important. So if we can just look at the next slide, which is sort of a detail and very nicely put together for me. And we've highlighted sort of a larger part of that map to show the Rue Sainte-Anne was one of these main busy streets I mentioned that a lot of these men lived on, or a lot of these families had houses on, owned houses on, in order to capitalize on trade. And even after the British period, they maintained those houses. They continued to own them, and they rented them to incoming British traders. So they were, again, still sort of powerful in that way. I've also showed, if you look at the top, at the very top, there's the habitation. So that's where there was some agricultural development around the fort. It's still a small European presence, right? Compared to, and a lot of these European maps will sort of concentrate on showing, not all of them, but many of them, where they hope to maintain some sort of European imperial presence. But really, even after the War of 1812, past about a mile back from the river, there's not much European settlement past that. So the smaller sort of highlighted square shows the village of the Ottawa, which is in what is now Windsor, Ontario. This is where the Odawa community was located, where Pontiac was located during the events of 1763. And I didn't highlight it here. I didn't ask Anne to highlight it, but right on the Detroit side, beside the habitation, is the Potawatomi village. So all of these locations are also indicated on this map. Next slide, please. I'm going off script. So this is another excellent map. There are so many from the Clements collection. And it depicts the Great Lakes region right after the 7 Years' War has ended, the 7 Years' War between the French and the British, with the French losing that war and having to give up the majority of their colonies they claim to possess in North America. Detroit was sort of one of those regions. So if you look at this map as well, it does still indicate, although it's a little hard to see, but you can tell that this map does indicate where Indigenous people are located throughout, like the Eastern Seaboard and into the Great Lakes. It's sort of it gives the incoming British a sense of where things are at, you know, what they're arriving to, what they're going to need to do to sort of have a political and economic presence in this region. Next slide, please. Trying to keep this brief too. And this is a closer detail. This is an iconic, famous map that the Clements has done a lot of work on researching. So this shows the fort at Detroit in 1760. So again, this is the eve of the British presence. We see, as I mentioned, some of these same streets that were pivotal during the French period remain pivotal during the British period. There's efforts by the British to sort of establish more official buildings, stores, magazines for munitions inside of this region. So it's also an effort on the part of the British to sort of like maintain control, to think about this region as a British space. And again, this is a really small a window that that they're trying to remain in control of in Detroit. Next slide, please. So this is not from the Clements collection, but this is from the National Archives in the UK. And this is a journal of James MacDonald during the siege by Pontiac and other Indigenous nations who have taken down most of the forts in the Great Lakes. Fort Detroit was one of those forts that didn't fall, although there was an effort made for 6 months. So as the British are coming into this region in 1760, they have this feeling that because they've defeated the French, they've also defeated sovereign Indigenous nations who fought along with the French or were perceived as being allied with the French. And of course, that was not the case, right? And so on the part of Indigenous peoples who had been resident in Detroit and the Great Lakes, there was an effort to remind the British that Indigenous nations remain sovereign in this region. And the British chose to ignore this fact. So this brought on the events of the attack on the forts. And James MacDonald, he'd been taken captive by the Wendat at Fort Duquesne during the 7 Years' War. So he had been at Detroit. And then after the events of the war, when the British take over the French forts, he comes back, he's a lieutenant. And the interesting thing, he keeps this diary during the course of 1763, from the first attack in April through to November. And in previous correspondence we have from his commanding officer, there's reference made to the fact that he's suffering from melancholy. He's been, he fell in love with a local woman. We don't know who it is, but it is so serious a matter that his commanding officer is trying to get him removed. His health is not very good. He's trying to get him sent to Fort Pitt. This doesn't happen because the war breaks out, Pontiac attacks, and MacDonald has to stay there. And from what I'm able to understand, or from some of my research, it's likely that he fell in love with a local French woman, and probably a member of one of these families I'm talking about. And I want to talk a little bit about that in greater length when Jonathan and I continue our conversation. So it's a pivotal document that a lot of historians, a lot of British officials at the time and a lot of historians and antiquarians in the decades and centuries that are going to follow are going to use to understand what happened. And it's written by a man who has been rejected by members of the local community. So it's telling. And again, I want to talk more about that a little later when Jonathan and I have our conversation. Next slide, please. So here is the iconic, famous James Sterling letter book that I'm hoping Jonathan and I can talk a little bit about, maybe even right now, Jonathan.
Right. I think we can get into James Sterling's letter book in 1 second. I just wanted to ask, through that description and as you're talking through the book, you were talking a lot about this being a kind of contestation of power in the Great Lakes and around Detroit between first the French Empire and then the British Empire. And I'm just curious, one of the aspects of your book that I appreciated the most is because it challenges our perception of hegemonic imperial control. So who's actually controlling commerce and trade in Detroit? But I think also patriarchal control within families and within relationships, who has power and agency and who's making decisions. So just maybe a specific question before we get to Sterling. What does imperial control look like in Detroit? How are the French and British attempting to assert control, and how are they coming into conflict with these French Indigenous families and broader networks? Or is it a story of cooperation, occasionally working together? Just how would you describe that relationship between the families and imperial powers and imperial agents?
Thanks for that great question, Jonathan. I think your point that it was a mix. It was a relationship, particularly during the French period. It was a relationship which sometimes meant that these members of these families were working together with official imperial agents, whether we're talking about the commandant locally or the governor general in Quebec or the King of France. And at other times, they worked outside of the imperial system. And one of the points I make in my book is that if you follow some of these families and connect some of them, they have lives and careers that show them in positions of incredible power in terms of sort of representing the imperial presence, particularly in as translators with Indigenous nations or even at diplomatic meetings. But some of these same people are jailed or fined or being sought out to be punished because they're engaging in illegal activities. These families, like I said, their connections ranged all the way from Quebec down to Louisiana to the Illinois country. And they became absolutely essential for, particularly in the case of the French, the imperial presence did not penetrate very far past the St. Lawrence Valley. So imperial officials were dependent on members of these families and on their connections to Indigenous nations to sort of maintain some kind of control, which was often illusory. So some of these men and women are trading with the English, and depending on whether the French or British were at war, that trade was legal or not legal, depending. They were trading with the British in New York and near Albany. They were trading with the British in Carolina. Some of the members of the family that are in the Illinois country down in Louisiana are trading illegally there. So it's complex, and I think it really comes together during Pontiac's War. As I mentioned before, the British have a illusory control in that region. They're trying to figure out how they can sort of penetrate some of these networks or gain some sort of economic control. And while the 6-month siege is taking place, we have families wherein some members, at least on paper, are translating for the incoming British commandant with Odawa warriors or their Indigenous warriors. And so they seem to be working with the British, and the nephews of some of these people are working together with Pontiac. The British are trying to find them so they can hang them for treason. So it's a really mixed bag.
Mhm. Good, thank you. Yeah, I think now would be a great time to talk about Sterling's letter book. And if I could just really briefly introduce it for the audience, James Sterling's letter book is a collection of outgoing letters penned by Irish-born merchant and fur trader James Sterling, who was active in Detroit throughout the 1760s and 1770s. And you can see on the screen now the letter book itself, and on the left, an example of a letter. So I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about how you use Sterling's letter book in your narrative, Karen, and particularly what it tells us about women's lives in Detroit, and also about these networks that you discuss.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. So I did use Sterling's letter book to sort of figure out who were the women who were iconic in events in the 1760s in Detroit. So Sterling, as Jonathan knows from his own work, comes to Detroit after the British have won their war with the French, and he's perplexed, right? He's had a successful trading operation in New York, in Oswego, and places like Oswego. And so he comes to Detroit, and he's trying to figure out how he can make a go of it in Detroit. And as is often the case with people you think, if you knew in real life, you probably might not like because they have very strong opinions. He's one of these people. So he has a very strong opinion about local people. He calls the French cattle, he's not able to sort of get an economic toehold. So he's feeling frustrated. And he sees himself as being very distinct from local people, French and Indigenous. But he marries Angélique Cuillerier du Beaubien, and she is a member of one of the most powerful families in these networks I've studied at Detroit. And she speaks multiple Indigenous languages. She conducts trade. Her father is a close ally of Pontiac's. And so things change for Sterling as soon as he marries her. And he really records this. And I've, at numerous conferences, read a portion from his diary where he talks about that. He talks about her father being really rich, how he's going to be able to conduct trade a lot more cheaply. He doesn't need to hire translators. She can do the translating for him. This is just sort of one of the examples where women in this diary come up. And, he also refers to having sexual relations with Indigenous women in this diary. And that is something historians are just sort of starting to look at. And I also examine in my book that there were a lot of influential European men holding influential positions who are either married to or in relationships with Indigenous women. And I think this is what makes Pontiac's war so contentious. So Jonathan, I'm going to ask you now what you found interesting is a good general question about Sterling's diary, his letter.
Right. Yeah, thanks. So I think we had mentioned that Sterling is running a rather large fur trade operation and commercial operation in Detroit. And what fascinates me is that he can't do this alone. He doesn't have the connections to the community, as Karen discussed. So I think it's a question of marrying into these elite families, which is really interesting about the document and this kind of social climb of Sterling. But something I'm very interested in is also his relationships with kind of his French workers and his subordinates. And he comes to rely on them for translation, for paddling canoes, for packing and shipping furs. They're really really intimately involved in his operations. Something that also comes up, and I'm interested in, a kind of a newer and emerging aspect of history of the 18th century Great Lakes, is looking at enslaved populations. And there are slaves in Detroit, Indigenous and Black, that are working in a variety of capacities, including for Sterling. So we really get traces and fragments of that that come out in some of these outgoing letters. But it's really, they're fragments. And it's a clue that you need to pursue and use other sources for. But a lot on kind of interpersonal relationships across ethnic and racial lines. And I think also class lines as well, which I find really interesting. Even though this is a frontier post in the interior of North America, there's still gradations of class with very elite people having fancy balls and get-togethers, and then slaves and laborers kind of on the other end of the social hierarchy. So it's a really interesting, interesting considering that Detroit is really developing in that sense, despite being in the interior. And something that I also like is I'm very interested in kind of working people and laborers. And that comes across too in Sterling's letter book. And we get a sense for, what the French laborers are doing, where slaves are working. There's mention of a quarry 13 miles south of Detroit that I've always been interested in and would like to look that up. But also talking about kind of women's work and kind of women's roles in society is very interesting too. So maybe I'll use that as an opportunity to shift into another question for Karen. And just thinking about, we have Indigenous society and European society in this context of 18th century Detroit. And we're thinking about what women would be doing. So can you talk a little bit about maybe gender roles, in Detroit at this period? What are the kind of expectations for Indigenous women and for European women also? And are those changing over time?
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm going to keep coming back to that sort of middle chapter in my book, and that pivotal time between French imperial and British imperial presence. But so from the very beginning, Indigenous women, first of all, Indigenous women and all of these nations I've mentioned that were resident in the region are leaders or chiefs in their nations. And there's lots of references to this in European imperial archives, right? And there's been some work done on this, but there's a lot more work to do because they are all over those records. I mean, I ran across numerous references. The French Governor General calling a Haudenosaunee a woman, metaphorically his daughter, back at the turn of the 18th century, and he's giving her gifts to cover the death of her father. So this is the Governor General who's interacting with an Indigenous woman. So she's definitely probably a leader in her nation, and he's giving her gifts. So she's a diplomat, right? And we see these women come up in records as we sort of move into the interior. There's a woman named La Blanche, who's referenced at Michilimackinac, who's an Odawa woman leader. And the French Governor General has sent gifts through the system of lakes, and he wants those gifts given to her. There's a Peoria woman in the Illinois country, the daughter of the leader Chachagues, who travels to Montreal with her father to receive diplomatic gifts from Vaudreuil, the Governor General, and also to take messages back to the Illinois and to the Peoria. So there are a lot of women like this that are mentioned, Indigenous women who are mentioned in all of the in the imperial archives. And like I said, a lot more work can be done on them. So during Pontiac's War, James McDonald, I'm going to go back to his diary. He mentions a woman who has let the British know in advance that Pontiac plans to attack the fort, right? And this is a sort of story about the British finding out in advance that sort of becomes, gets romanticized through the centuries. And we have Francis Parkman writing a history of Pontiac's War in the 19th century. And he sort of reinvents the figure of this Indigenous woman who supposedly let the British know as this sort of very attractive young woman, right, who's having an affair with the British commandant. We don't know whether that's true or not. But as we get into the 19th century, any sort of economic or political power this woman might have had, and she's variously said to be, she's Anishinaabe, she's either Potawatomi or Ojibwa. We learn a lot less about what she might have been doing there, or what women leaders may have been doing in terms of taking part in trade in the fort. And it sort of becomes a story that's just about her as a sexual being, right? As being this person who was having this affair. So it divorces us from some of the actual facts of the 18th century, what's going on. So this was a powerful woman. And there's another story that the woman who let the British know was Angélique Cuillertier-Beaubien. So different historians in the 19th century are saying she's the one who let the British know. Well, here we have another powerful woman, right? Who's a multilingual, involved in trade, has a mother who runs the family business, and French women as procuratrices, as women who are running their family sort of business empires, are also incredibly powerful. So when we've got that line in the Sterling book that Jonathan knows, and I've used in my book, where he's writing back to his New York partners about hiring a translator, and he says about his wife, calling her Mrs. Sterling, he says, you know, I don't want her to operate in that role. He says, I don't want her to ride after the Indians, right? I don't want her to be participating so completely in trade with Indigenous nations. I want her here in my house with me. So it's a different sort of British norm, different from what French women or Indigenous women would have understood women did. And also, as we see in Sterling's book, we see a lot of details about the trade Sterling and Angélique, as his wife, are engaged in, including trade in slaves, which you mentioned, Jonathan. But he's sort of trading in like materials the army might have needed there, you know, sort of foodstuffs, munitions, stuff like that. She's trading in materials that show us she had deep connections to Indigenous communities. So she's acquiring furs, she's acquiring goods like this from places as far away as the northern tip of Lake Superior, right? Mm-hmm. And she's you know, bringing those goods into her partnership with her husband, and he's using those goods to curry favor with British officials. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Really, really interesting. And it leads really well into my next question, in that I found it so interesting that we both read Sterling's letter book and we kind of took different things from it. We were able to find evidence for each of our kind of arguments in our analysis. And what really struck me is that from these really, you know, in 150 or so letters that Sterling's writing, he's not really mentioning Angélique very often. So, you know, it's fragmentary evidence. So I'm curious if you can talk about how you went about piecing together these larger networks, you know, identifying Angélique's family, finding these kind of distant relations, considering which Indigenous groups they might have been attached to. So I'm just curious if you could talk about your method as a historian for pulling together, you know, all of these fragmentary traces, you know, into a cohesive narrative, and maybe some of the other sources you relied on for that.
Great question. I tend to, you know, for lack of a way to I guess to describe myself, I guess I describe myself as a microhistorian. I like to sort of start by examining, you know, individuals particularly, or individual events or localities, and then sort of build context, right? Sort of to follow the people. In doing that, I relied a lot on some great work that genealogists, French genealogists, some of whom are on this talk, have done for decades with some of these records. And then sort of what was interesting was finding some of these people in official records, like Sterling's letter book. And for example, the Cuillertier-Beaubien family, Angelique's great-grandfather, René Cuillier, really starts the family sort of integration into Native societies. He's actually taken captive near the end of the 17th century while he's quarrying stone in Montreal, and he's taken captive by the Oneida, Haudenosaunee, and he lives for a year. He's adopted as a member of an Oneida family, and then he eventually leaves. So when he goes back to Montreal, he maintains his connection to the Oneida, and he becomes a translator. So we have generations of her family that have been interacting with Indigenous peoples, marrying into Indigenous families before we get to Detroit. I mean, the Beaubien family cannot become as powerful as it does on the eve of the British arrival without this history. So for me, it was, like I said, using great materials that genealogists have used and have shared with me that I found. Looking at church records, these are records. St. Anne's church records are really detailed. I mean, they have baptisms of French and Indigenous peoples. They have, in many cases, have the names of their parents. And so I'd often find I could find, for example, Angelique's family and some of the Jesuit relations. I can find them in church records. I can find them in Sterling's letter book. And so it was painstaking because most of these people did not leave any of their own records, as you know, right? Not all of them, but a lot of them were illiterate, or some of them were able to read or write, but didn't leave very many to any records of their own. So I have to rely on finding them in the records of other people. So it is an incredibly rewarding and painstaking process. And there's some good stories in the book where I'm able to piece together stories from some of these diverse sources and come up with a narrative.
Right. And I think we have one more slide, a photo of a French-Indigenous dictionary it's on the screen. Could you talk about, Karen, a little bit about linguistic analysis and dealing with these problems of French language, British language, or English, and then of course Indigenous languages of the kind of multitude of Indigenous groups that you're dealing with? How do you navigate issues of translation and language?
Great question, and again, it's a very difficult task. This slide is a page from what is referred to as the Gravier Dictionary. It's French, Illinois, or Miami, Illinois. The language was very similar, used by Miami and Illinois people. And it was produced by Jesuits. Jesuits were missionizing in a lot of Indigenous communities. They recorded some of these dictionaries. They're now being used in a way that the missionaries might have not necessarily intended, but they're being used to reclaim for language reclamation these days. I know the Miami Nation have used these dictionaries quite a bit in the past. So I was able to use a lot of the work done, particularly with the Miami language. There's great work being done at Miami University by George Ironstrack and Daryl Baldwin and David Costa. So I used their book. Thank you, Megan. This particular dictionary shows translations, like I said, between French and Indigenous people. And for example, I was, again, with the help of the people at Miami University, able to find the name of a slave who shows up in French St. Anne's Church records. And I was able to figure out, because his whole name is in the record and his Illinois last name, to figure out what the translation of his name meant. And that helped me sort of figure out where he had traveled before he came to Detroit, and to connect him with one of these members of the family who likely, whose slave he likely was. So the same thing with French, because and a lot of people on this call know, dealing with 18th century French, it has its own challenges that make it very different from dealing with contemporary French. So I had to keep that in mind. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to, as much as possible, incorporate Indigenous language or Indigenous meanings of concepts. So I'm sure I made a number of mistakes, but my effort was trying to be inclusive in terms of multiple meanings. So this was one of the things that I used. It's a really extensive dictionary.
Right. Yeah, thanks. I think the breadth of sources, church records, dictionaries from the French and English periods, your use of those sources really comes across. And I think it's a great strength of the book, seeing all these different sources and how they can be used. Just kind of staying mindful of the time, and because this is the Clements Bookworm, you mentioned early on that you had been a Clements Fellow and that you had done some research at the Clements. I just was curious if you could talk about maybe some other sources that you had used from the library for your work, and maybe a story or two about an experience at the library and working on this book.
Oh, thanks, Jonathan. Happy to talk about that. So when I was first at the Clements, well, first of all, one of my first memories was Brian Dunnigan taking me. There was the reading room was in the basement back then, and I remember him taking me into this little room that was just full of the records of Thomas Gage, who was the head of the British military in North America, right up to the year before the American Revolution. So post 7 Years' War, right up to the American Revolution. And that's one of the sort of cornerstones, as you know, Jonathan, collection at the Clements. And so there's multiple volumes, and they're all bound. And they had their entire room, and I was just like, oh my gosh, and that's what I went there to use, because I was looking for reference to Miami leader. Her name is Tecumseh. In 1774, she had been married to a French man, and there was a number of documents in this, these papers of this powerful man, right, about her marriage, because she's left one husband and she's with another husband, and it has it's not just about a marriage, right? And it just actually shows you how pivotal Indigenous women were, and alliance with Indigenous people were to European officials. So there's lots of discussion over multiple pages and letters and Gage's papers about Tecumseh, her French husband, who she married to. Her nation controls a portage on that riverway I was talking to that leads into the interior of the continent. It's 1774. Things are not looking good for the British, right? They're trying to maintain control of what's now Fort Wayne, Indiana, in that region. So all of a sudden, the marriage of this very powerful Miami woman becomes something Thomas Gage has to take notice of. So I loved that I found her story embedded in the papers of this very influential man. So the Gage papers were really important. And I've been back since. I've been starting a new project, and I've it takes place in the 1830s, in the era of the American passing of the Indian Removal Act. And I'm looking at Anishinaabe people in the Great Lakes, and particularly at Detroit, and the effect of some of this legislation on their movements through the area. So I've been able to use the papers of an Michigan elected official, Lucius Lyon, last time I was there. And I got a lot of great material from there that I've already published on. So every day I could have been there, I was trying to get them to adopt me there at the Clements, so I could stay there forever. There's so much more work I have to do there. It's so many great collections for our time period.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And a question that I have here is going to ask a little bit about your next project. You've given us a short description there, which I appreciate, but I just want to share again the book, if everyone can see, Detroit's Hidden Channels, Power of French-Indigenous Families in the 18th Century, which, is central to my own work and which I really recommend for people who want to know more about this era. I have kind of a final question, maybe, recognizing that you're mostly focused on kind of the British era, and Pontiac's War is central in the war and the involvement of women and kind of French Indigenous networks at that time. I think a lot of people on the call, and we know that in 1796, Detroit becomes an American city in Michigan, starting to be formed. What happens to these networks then? Are they able to maintain some control and influence? Or how do things change when a new power kind of enters the scene at Detroit?
Great question. So, and that is a good segue into where the second book is going, because I'm also trying to figure out what's going on in these families in the 1830s, right? So they don't, their sort of political control has lessened considerably, as the British era continues and we come into the American era, but they still are located on some of these, increasingly pivotal regions that face the river. There's, in the larger picture, the 1790s are a tumultuous era for the American nation. I tell my students this, it wasn't just a given, the American Revolution happens and we have a new nation, it's ready to go. In the 1790s, it looked like it might not go, right? And places like Detroit, which are still located inland from most of the Eastern Seaboard colonies, they really don't know how far they can venture out into these regions, which remain under Indigenous control. So we still have these French Indigenous families, they're operating there, but this is still a region that will remain for many decades, even politically, in Indigenous sort of controlled areas. So these families are continuing to trade and they're continuing to be powerful. And in the War of 1812, we're going to see the same thing happen as did during Pontiac's War, in that there's, some are going to ally with the British, some with the French, but in terms of Indigenous people, the ultimate aim is to maintain their sovereignty, to maintain their nations, right? They're still powerful, just the power goes underground in a way.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks.
I just want to acknowledge too that I know there's a number of people on this call who have written some great books, and not everybody's sort of even put anything in the chat, and I just want to call them out, in a good way, call them out. Catherine Kanganey's fantastic book, Frontier Seaport, which is an economic history of Detroit, which places French and Indigenous women at the center of Detroit's economy, including the moccasin trade, which is something I didn't know about until Katie shared her work with me. So it's another thing that's going on during Pontiac's War. Indigenous women are running the trade, the moccasin trade. Elizabeth Demers, who has written about the Askin family and enslavement of Indigenous peoples, continues to work on that. And Jonathan's work, of course, and I know Dan Harrison's out there. I know there are a lot of other people out there doing some great work that I'm grateful for.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I think it would be time for the question and answer. Angela, would that be?
Oh yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. This has been so interesting, and some of those other historians have chimed in the chat and in the questions, which has been lovely too. So stay on the line, everybody. And if you do have some questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A section. I am just going to do a couple of housekeeping items, and then we will get to the questions. So now that you're registered for the Clements Bookworm, you'll receive a reminder every month for our programs. You can choose to join live, or if you're unable to do so, we do send out an email with a link to the recording and resources mentioned in the broadcast. And in fact, you'll receive that later today. So we're continuing to talk about Michigan next month. So if you join us on August 20th, we'll be talking to Lynn Evans, Curator of Archaeology for Mackinac State Historic Parks, and she will discuss how archaeology and history are used to gain a more complete picture of life on the fur trade frontier. So we're excited to have that program coming up. I'd like to say again that we're really thankful to Doug Johnson for sponsoring today's episode of the Bookworm. And we're thankful to all of you for signing in and participating in the conversation and being part of our community. So if you're able and don't yet support us financially, we certainly appreciate that effort as well. And if you're interested in sponsoring a future episode of the Bookworm, you can contact myself or Ann Bennington-Helber. So without further ado, let's look at the questions, and I'm going to go backwards super fast because there were a couple of questions on the early maps. So while we still have this pulled up, Dale was wondering where the fort is located on this map. And then we also have a question about why the habitations are shown in a grid rather than as ribbon farms.
Well, I mean, to take where's Brian when I need him? To take the last question first, if you look closely, it does appear that those are ribbon farms leading back from the waterway, right? At least I don't know what you think, Jonathan. And the fort is sort of if I'm looking at this correctly, is right inside sort of that region that indicates habitation. I think I'm correct. If I'm not correct, please correct me. But it does indicate we've got what's now Belle Isle across, in the waterway between the northern and southern shore of the Detroit River, and other sort of important locations, some of which I've mentioned as we sort of traverse down the Detroit River, going west.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'm right about that.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop my share because I don't think we need the slides for the remaining questions. So I noticed that, we have, because there's so many different groups, we do have a lot of questions about things like, did the French maintain their aristocracy at the time?
Great question. Where's Guillaume Teasdale when I need him? So my colleague at the University of Windsor, who's another phenomenal book we could throw into the chat, Guillaume Teasdale's book on Detroit, who's an expert on French political system. So that's a really complex question, because Detroit's status, in the French imperial nation was always in question. Cadillac wanted to be, he wanted to sort of be in complete control, sort of something on the, as we might think about somebody, a lord, somebody who owns land and parcels it out to individuals. And he was never given, first of all, he was there for such a short amount of time. He left in 1710, but he was never given that amount of control there. So he tried to sort of charge people to use things like, sawmills and where's Katie when I need her? And other sort of economic sort of materials there, but he was operating illegally when he tried to do that. He often did some things illegally anyway. So it's got a very, very peripheral position within the French imperial system. It doesn't operate the same way as the French Empire in the St. Lawrence Valley, for example, operates.
Thank you. Thanks. Yes, and Professor Teasdale was a panelist on the Bookworm as well previously. So, all right, thank you. So Rochelle is wondering then about the Indigenous people and if they used any types of resistance to try to maintain their lands, culture, heritage, etc.
Rochelle, great question. So definitely throughout the entire 18th century, and we hear a lot less about this directly because we do not hear their voices in the records, right? When we do hear their voices, they're indirectly represented in imperial records because we have French and British records that talk about meetings or diplomatic meetings and the giving of gifts, issues, potential political problems, wars breaking out, and there are a lot of specific references to specific Indigenous peoples, men and women, as I mentioned, who are leaders of their nations, right? So, because traditionally, as most of us know already on this call, because we have had mostly just European records, our view of what this era looked like is muted by those Euro-dominant records. So most definitely throughout the 18th century, Indigenous people, like I say, there are thousands of Indigenous nations in the Great Lakes and Illinois country. Some of them are establishing communities that I've mentioned at Detroit. Some of them are not, but they still have representatives and people who are, coming to Detroit for meetings, who are operating within alliances with European nations. But Pontiac's War is really the moment at which Indigenous sovereignty, which has been operating this entire time. So Indigenous nations are doing what they need to do for their own nations, furthering their own agendas for themselves. It's sort of, that event sort of breaks through into the imperial record. We get to hear or see what's going on in these Indigenous polities because it becomes an issue for the British, who have just arrived in Detroit, just arrived in the Great Lakes, and are very worried and come very close to sort of losing their political toehold in the region. So Pontiac's War represents a moment at which we really see this come to the surface. Something we know has been going on, but we don't have a lot of traditional records for, but this moment at which the complex Indigenous politics and economic systems burst through into the imperial record. And like I say, it happens to come together with learning about how important Indigenous women were to this process. And that's why I think it's such, women have been missing from the story. Indigenous women have been missing from the story. When I started studying this history decades ago, the Indigenous women that were part of the story, there were so few to none of them. But they were there, they're there. And there are histories in each of these nations today Anishinaabe women know how powerful they are, right? They're to this day, right now, they're operating as leaders in their nations, Wendat women. So nothing's changed.
So there's a question that that maybe goes with this, wondering about looking at some of those other sources from the tribes, you know, the storytelling, the oral histories. Are you able to take any of that information and add it to your research?
Great question. So what I, especially for the book and moving forward, you know, for the second project, I'm going to be continuing to do this because I concentrated on Miami women, or Miami families, at least in some of these families that I sort of followed through the century. I was very reliant on, I mentioned George Einstrack, who's Miami. He has a blog, you know, he maintains sort of Miami history. He's a historian for his nation, a historian in general. And so I was able to, you know, Jonathan mentioned before, triangulating, sort of finding people in different sources to find information about Miami people or about events that concerned Miami people I might not have known the whole picture of if I just relied on European sources. I was able to, and I was grateful for being able to use George Einstrack's histories that are online, that anybody can read. And to like Jonathan mentioned, language, to try as best I could to integrate Indigenous languages in order to understand the people I was talking about, understand who they were and their journeys.
Thank you. Thanks. Just before we move on to some of the other questions, I wanted to mention that Mary Pedley, wonderful map scholar Mary Pedley, gave us a little more information about that map.
Thank you, Mary.
Jacques Bellin, who was a map maker with the French Navy and what you might call an office geographer. So the map would have been compiled from a variety of sources and not really based on eyewitness surveys. And Suzanne Somerville also mentioned that there's an arrow in the river and the fort is at the left end. So I don't know, maybe I'll just pull it up.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Mary.
So yes, so here's that little arrow. So we can see where the fort is. Okay, so yes, thank you. So that makes sense why it doesn't look exactly geographically like some of the subsequent maps that were eyewitness accounts.
I really appreciate, thanks Mary and Suzanne, to you sharing that information. And it's also, you know, what Mary mentioned, it's also a good moment to mention something many of us know, that maps are, you know, the accuracy of maps, more often they were sort of efforts by people to sort of, at least on paper, claim control of a region, right? And this often happened with European powers that are coming over and coming into regions that are Indigenous spaces. And so they don't have any control, any political or economic control in those spaces, but they try to map them, right? And claim them. And so they're not accurate. They're, in many cases, it's sort of wishful thinking based on maybe some information, as Mary mentioned, that people are trying to gather to put together patchwork style.
Right. Thank you. I see that we still have a couple more questions about power. Michelle's wondering if the Jesuits had much power.
So power. That's a real, that's a great word. It's a loaded word. So the Jesuits were we have a lot more experts on this call who know a lot more about this than I do, but the Jesuits were resident in the Detroit region near the beginning, not right at the beginning of the 18th century. It was a different order, the Récollets, who were the first sort of Catholics who were a resident in Detroit, who maintained the records at St. Anne's. The Jesuits do come in to missionize, and there are some spectacular records, particularly by Père Pierre Poitiers, who was a Jesuit scholar and priest in the middle of the 18th century, and he's missionizing mostly among the Wendat on the Canadian, on what is now the Canadian side of the river. And what am I grateful to him for? I'm grateful to the massive amount of records he created, where he actually recorded the names of Wendat people and who was living where and the relationship to each other. So in terms of the power the Jesuits had, I mean, they were called different sort of arms of the French imperial state in terms of cultural ambassadors. They sometimes had good relations with Indigenous people they were working among, sometimes not so good. So I think it's a complicated question.
Right. So again, another group in the area interacting and influencing this at this time period. Thank you. So now I see there are several questions specifically about your book, so I'd like to go to those. Elizabeth mentions that she enjoyed your book and is double checking. She wants to make sure that anytime we read about a European being adopted into a tribe, that whether or not the person was actually enslaved. And I see Patricia has a comment about that, and I thought it would be good to give you a chance to talk more about it.
In terms of, I do mention slavery in the book. I particularly mention in a chapter where I talk about at least the term for something that happened that historians of the Great Lakes, starting with Richard White back in 1991, have been talking about an event that historians called the Fox Wars, which broke out at Detroit in 1712. And it was a war that broke out between the French and some allied Indigenous nations of the Great Lakes against the Meskwaki people, people of the Red Earth. There was a long and complicated history of that contentious relationship, not always contentious, but it does break out at Detroit. And the church records at Detroit, I found it really interesting when I did research in the church records and sort of found evidence of this happening in the records. So Cadillac had invited Meskwaki people to settle in 1710, or they began arriving to settle in the community. The French weren't at war with the Meskwaki then. And they had arrived, and they had begun arriving, and you find them in the church records. We see their names, the fact that they're called Utagami or Renard, which is the French word for fox. And so they're baptized, you know, how that doesn't mean they were practicing Catholics, but they're integrated into the community that way. We see godparents, godmother, godfather. And then the war breaks out. In June of 1712, and if you look at church records, we see baptisms of Meskwaki people taking part, but the entries look completely different because these people are now captive of war. They've been enslaved, they become slaves. And so we don't see their names anymore. The French state required that slaves be baptized, and I would urge people to read Brett Rushforth's excellent book, which gives a great history of the complexity of slavery during the French period, not just in North America, but also in the Caribbean. And he does talk about Detroit. So we, in terms of adoption, and this is something that Brett talks about in his book, there were varying sort of states of being enslaved or adopted that existed even before the French arrived. And the French sort of continued the system in order to maintain alliances with indigenous nations. So a person's status as enslaved might change in the course of their lifetime. And it might look very different across different places and across different indigenous nations, right? Even within French families. So I think I'm giving a very indirect, maybe not specific example because it's complicated.
Right. And so that's from the perspective of a French family incorporating indigenous people. But what happens when indigenous tribes incorporate European people?
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't really come across a lot of that in records for the time period. I mean, Detroit are the people I was studying. Now I teach early American history, and there are a lot of sort of iconic texts, Mary Richardson's text, which are stories about English people being taken captive by indigenous people on the frontier, right? So I don't talk a lot about that in my book because those particular instances, at least I didn't happen upon them in my book. I think when we're talking about sort of two, different indigenous nations marrying French people, you've got varying degrees of acculturation. Like most often we see French people taking on indigenous ways, right? In order to sort of, oftentimes, like I mentioned, the men have married into families, they're adopted into families, they've married into families, they have, they function within an indigenous world. They have to. And so they may act in ways that other Europeans may identify as being indigenous, So, and a good example of this is when the British come into Detroit in the 1760s, and I mentioned this with Sterling, a lot of French women have been so integrated into their families' fur trade activities, and they know indigenous languages. It's a hybrid sort of economic and political system that British men are marrying them as an entree into this sort of world, the same way French men had married indigenous women as an entree into this world. So it's really complex. Again, I keep saying that word, complex.
Tom is wondering if people who were enslaved could be freed.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I mean, that's a simple, like I can give a simple answer. Yes, they could be. They're like, as I mentioned a little earlier, it's a complex system, and people move through it in different ways. So yes, the short answer.
Right. Yes. Okay. So let's see. Suzanne Somerville has a lot of information. She's someone who works with, oh, now I lost it.
Suzanne does always have a lot of information.
The historical French. I had it on my screen a minute ago. So Suzanne, if you feel inclined to put it in the chat and a link, that would be great. It seems like there's a lot of amazing genealogical work that has been done by your group and by you in particular. So please share that for those who are interested in taking a closer look. And so maybe one more question about slavery, because as you said, it's so complicated. People are definitely trying to wrap their minds around it. Were we also talking about Black slaves at that time? Were there also indentured people? So maybe just if you have any more details about that.
There were Black slaves at this time in Detroit, many fewer than there were Indigenous slaves. And I would encourage people to read Taya Miles's book, The Dawn of Detroit, to read a little bit more about that. Thank you, Suzanne. And I talk a little bit, like some of the families that I follow, again, I would be talking for hours and people their eyes would be glazing over if I sort of went over all of this detailed information I provide. But there is a family like the Droit family. Suzanne knows a lot about them, and I talk about them in the book, where you have Pierre Roy, who is his father emigrates from France, and they settle around Montreal in a place called La Prairie, which is very close to a Haudenosaunee community, a Mohawk community. So they're growing up right there. And then Pierre Roy Jr. ends up becoming an engagé. So he's traveling for a year at a time into places like Detroit before Cadillac and the French fort has arrived. He marries into a Miami family. He has a number of brothers, and they settle in Montreal, and they're all sort of part of this large trade network, right? So Pierre's living among his wife's people in what is now Fort Wayne, Indiana, in the Miami homelands, still the Miami homelands. And so he's conducting trade there with the Miami. He's got a brother who's back in Montreal. He's got another brother who settles down in what's now New Orleans, right? He settles in New Orleans. And he's also part of this trade network. And they're moving through Detroit. And some of the Pierre Roy and his Miami wife have Indigenous slaves, and they're godparenting for Indigenous slaves. The brother who's living down in New Orleans is trying to grow sugarcane. And so censuses there show him having Black slaves. So this is all within one family, right? So many fewer Black slaves in Detroit. And those that did come mostly came from New York and from the English colonies. Again, Taya Miles's book will give a lot more great information about this.
Yes, thank you. And Anne shared that in the chat.
Thank you, Anne.
A couple more questions about writing the book. So we have a question, and you mentioned this briefly, but Doug Johnson's wondering about your editorial decisions regarding the naming of Indigenous nations. And so he noticed that with one exception found so far in your book, you chose not to always insert parentheticals showing the colonized versions.
Okay, so I'm just showing the colonized versions of, I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Indigenous nations. So he took note of that and just wondered about that decision. And
I try wherever possible, and I think I don't even think I need to say this because I'm sure everybody on this session feels the same way about this. And I tell my students that you have to maintain a attitude of humility when you're doing your work, when we're doing the work of historians, right? So you have to be willing to admit how little you know, and that allows you to stay open to learning. And that's what I did in this process. And even if I was going to be starting to write this book today, it would look different than what it looked like. It started as a dissertation almost 20 years ago. So as I was revising for publication, I made even more. I had made an effort to incorporate Indigenous terms like language terms to learn at least some basic sort of Anishinaabean, very basic, so I could sort of understand some of the names of people or tribes or clans I was talking about in the book. So wherever possible, or even, for example, I'm talking about, let's talk about that, the Miami woman, and again, people on this call will be very familiar with her, who married Pierre Roy. In French records, she's referred to as Marguerite Uabankikoe. She's probably Crane Band. It's likely that her brother was a leader who allied with the French. Thanks to George Ironstrap's blog, I was able to find her there and use the proper Miami term for her name, which is Wapaniqua, right? So I tried to sort of put a, for people who may be looking at the French records or the European-based records, who might find her there to state that name, and then to also state the name when I could find it, her proper Indigenous name, right? So, and same with tribes or nations. I made an effort. Could I have done better? I'm sure I could have done better. Keep working at that. Next book.
Yeah, I think the effort is definitely very much appreciated, though. So thank you. You also mentioned church records, and Barbara's just wondering if you found them in the churches in Detroit or if they're located someplace else.
Well, as many folks on this call know, St. Anne's church records are available on microfilm at the Burton Historical Collection at the Detroit Public Library. So you can, thankfully for all of us, you can go there and look at them in microfilm.
Yes, thank you. I think there are a couple questions about marriage, and then we probably need to wrap up, even though I think this is a conversation that could go on all day and we're all learning so much from each other. But, I think Donna mentioned, she's like, why would this very talented and interconnected, accomplished woman marry this guy who thought the French and Indigenous folks were lesser humans? So, I think that was, I forgot which person that was at this point, but I think it's an interesting question if you have any hints.
Suzanne says the St. Anne's records are also on Ancestry, and she mentioned a few places. Thank you, Suzanne. So why did Angélique Cuillerrier du Beaubien marry James Sterling? Sounds like such a jerk. Great question. I think local French families recognized particularly after Pontiac's War, after 1763, that the British weren't going anywhere in terms of their political presence within the fort. And I mean, even, and if we're looking just at French-British history of this time period, even before the 7 Years' War, we got people like George Washington, right? Land surveyors, ominous job to have, particularly for Indigenous people, but they're sort of striking out from the Eastern Seaboard, places like Virginia, just moving west. And, there are, the English have sort of tried to maintain forts, and they've set up forts. They're trying to battle it out with the French for control of that region. They just had more people on the ground than the French did, right? I mean, all of us who study this history know this, and there's lots of historians talking about why is that the case? And, there were just many fewer French bodies in the interior of the continent than there were British bodies, if we're just looking at European presence. So I think the French families or the French people in around the Detroit region recognize this fact. And they also saw that there were some lucrative sort of trade networks, and Jonathan studies this and talks about this, that the British had access to, goods that they had access to through these particular trade networks. And they just wanted to stay plugged in, right? Was it a marriage for love? I mean, there was a different concept, European concept of love at this time, and I don't know that much about that, but the women in these families were very savvy, you know, financially, economically savvy. So I think she was too. So.
Thank you. And I know Frank was asking if whether or not French women married Indigenous men.
French women married, I don't, you know, I'm sure that was going on. I don't talk about that in the book. I didn't find that in my records. Doesn't mean it's not there, that they weren't there. But I didn't find them. I mean, I do find in the records a lot of reference, like, you know, going back to Margarito Banquioy / Wapaniqua, that the French Governor General at one point in the early 18th century is writing saying, we need to get, because Pierre Roy and his family had moved away from Detroit, and he wants to sort of shore up the French presence in Detroit. And he actually writes a letter saying he wants Pierre Roy and his family to come back to Detroit. Because some people who are in positions of power, or know people locally who are, at least in terms of the French imperial people, they know who the power players, the indigenous power players are, right? And Wapaniqua was part of a very powerful family, right? I mean, she sort of was the entree to, at least for her clan, at least to the Crane Band, to people who could help the French in some way.
Right. Thank you.
Oh, Suzanne mentioned that she knows of a French woman who married an Iroquois man.
Thank you, Suzanne. I just want to mention, so thank you so much. This has been so amazing. And before we sign off, I just want to mention that Jonathan wrote a wonderful review of Brian Dunnigan's Frontier Metropolis. And so since we were talking about those maps of Detroit, people, if you haven't had a chance to read that, in our Clements Chronicles, you might want to check that out as well. So we all have so much to continue learning, and I think everybody's summer reading list has just been doubled or quadrupled. So it's amazing. So thank you, Karen, for all of this great information. Thank you, Jonathan, for leading the discussion. And thank you for everybody who stayed on for so long. We really appreciate that you're so interested and engaged and ask such great questions. So have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Angela, and everybody out there. It's been a pleasure to share space with you. Thank you.
Indeed. Thanks. Bye, everybody.